On a sweltering morning in the South Pacific, January 22, 1943, a young American officer named John George found himself crouched in the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, peering through a rifle scope that his own fellow soldiers had spent 6 weeks mocking relentlessly. He was 27 years old, an Illinois state shooting champion with an impressive record back home. But out here in the jungle west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal, he had exactly 0 confirmed kills to his name. The situation facing his unit was desperate and getting worse by the hour. Japanese snipers, 11 of them operating somewhere in the dense groves ahead, had killed 14 American soldiers in just the past 3 days. These weren't random casualties from firefights or artillery. These were precision kills, 1 bullet, 1 life, executed by invisible enemies hidden in the massive trees. George's commanding officer had called his personally owned Winchester rifle a toy. His fellow platoon leaders joked it was his mail-order sweetheart. And when he first unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, even the unit armorer couldn't hide his skepticism, asking whether this civilian hunting rifle was meant for deer or Germans. George explained calmly that it was for the Japanese, but the rifle never made it onto the transport ship when his unit deployed. It sat in a warehouse back in Illinois while George crossed the Pacific watching other men clean their standard-issue M1 Garands. His rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces, while the Garand that every other soldier carried weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's Winchester was bolt-action with a 5-round capacity. The Garand was semi-automatic with 8 rounds. And in the eyes of military doctrine, there was no comparison. The modern semi-automatic weapon was superior in every measurable way. Captain Morris had ordered George directly to leave that sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon into combat, but George carried it anyway because he knew something the others didn't, that in the right hands, precision mattered more than firepower. He had requested the rifle be forwarded through military mail, and 6 weeks later in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the weapon he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to purchase. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal in late December, taking over from men who had been fighting since August, who had captured and held Henderson Field, but had failed to take Mount Austin or clear the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanuca River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it something else, and 500 enemy soldiers had fortified it with 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 brutal days, losing 34 men killed and 279 wounded before finally securing the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his beloved Winchester exactly 0 times in actual combat, not once. The jungle around Point Cruz presented an entirely different kind of warfare. No fixed bunkers, no defensive positions you could see in assault, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and disappeared into the forest, melting into the massive banyan trees like ghosts. Some of those soldiers were highly trained snipers carrying scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew this jungle intimately. They understood how to wait, how to become invisible, how to kill without being seen. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he knelt filling canteens at a creek, 1 shot through the head. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol, both dead before anyone could identify where the shots came from. On January 21st, 3 more Americans died, one of them shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice without noticing anything wrong. That night, the battalion commander summoned George to headquarters. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria, and he desperately needed someone who could actually shoot back effectively. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could hit anything beyond paper targets at a county fair. George explained his credentials carefully: Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939, 23 years old at the time, making him the youngest winner in state history, consistently shooting 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. And with the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could put 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. One chance to show that a civilian hunting rifle could stand against military-trained Japanese snipers in actual combat. George spent that entire night meticulously checking every component of his Winchester. The rifle had been packed in thick cosmoline for the ocean voyage, and he cleaned it again despite having cleaned it a dozen times already, checked the scope mounts for any looseness, verified the eye relief, and loaded 5 rounds of standard 30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed back in Tennessee, the same cartridge the Garand fired, just military ball ammunition. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved quietly into position in the ruins of that Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The structure overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz where intelligence reported the snipers operated. The area was dominated by enormous banyan trees, some reaching 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick, and a skilled sniper could climb one of those giants before dawn and remain there all day completely invisible from the ground. George brought no spotter, no radio man for support. Just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began the patient work of glassing the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan provided 2.5 power magnification, not much by modern standards, but enough to detect movement in branches that the naked eye would completely miss. The jungle was never truly silent. Birds called, insects buzzed, distant artillery rumbled, and George had trained himself to filter out all that background noise and focus purely on movement. He glassed each tree methodically, left to right, top to bottom, searching for anything that didn't belong. At exactly 9:17 in the morning, he saw it. A branch moved with no wind. Just a small, deliberate shift 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched patiently. The branch moved again, and then he finally saw the shape. A man in dark clothing positioned in a fork where 3 thick branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where American soldiers had been moving supplies, completely unaware that he was being watched. George made his calculations, adjusted his scope 2 clicks right to compensate for wind, controlled his breathing the way he had done thousands of times in competition. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth at 3.5 pounds. He had spent countless hours adjusting it perfectly at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would discover if a civilian target rifle designed for deer hunting could kill a man who was trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger smoothly. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder with familiar authority. The sharp crack echoed through the jungle, and 240 yards away the Japanese sniper jerked violently and fell, his body tumbling 90 feet through the branches before hitting the ground near the base of the massive banyan tree with a sickening thud. George worked the bolt efficiently, The empty brass cartridge ejected, he chambered another round and kept his scope trained on that tree, waiting for any additional movement because he knew Japanese snipers worked in pairs, one shooter and one spotter. If he had just killed the shooter, then the spotter was somewhere very close. George began scanning the surrounding banyan trees carefully. The scope's limited magnification forced him to search slowly and methodically. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created deep shadows that made shapes nearly impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper in a different tree 60 yards north of the first. This one positioned lower, at maybe 50 feet up, and the Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk rapidly, retreating because he had heard that rifle shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed smoothly, led the movement slightly, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree, his rifle clattering through branches ahead of him. Both weapon and body hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills, and George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip with steady hands. His breathing remained controlled, his mind calm. This really was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except these targets could shoot back and wanted him dead. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt and debris into his face, and he immediately rolled left and pressed himself hard against the bunker wall, his heart pounding now because that shot had come from the southwest, a completely different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 long minutes before moving, barely breathing, then inched carefully back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest, knowing the shooter would have moved after taking that shot. That was basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate immediately. But in jungle this dense, the relocation options were actually quite limited. George found him at 11:38, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but made the critical mistake of remaining in the same tree. George centered the crosshairs on that dark shape and fired without hesitation. The third sniper fell silently through the canopy. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers, and word was spreading rapidly through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle just days ago were now asking if they could watch him work, wanting to see this civilian weapon in action. George refused every request because spectators drew attention and attention drew fire. He needed to work alone. The Japanese snipers adapted quickly after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight hours entirely. George spent the entire afternoon glassing trees and seeing absolutely nothing. No movement, no shapes, nothing. At 1,600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters where Captain Morris was waiting, and all the mockery had vanished from the captain's voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn the next day. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into thick mud and reduced visibility to almost nothing beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker waiting patiently for the weather to clear. The rain finally stopped at 8:15, and by 8:45 enough visibility had returned for him to resume work. George spotted his first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain, which was smart because the sound of rainfall masked all movement. And this sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday, which was also smart because they were clearly learning his capabilities and adjusting their tactics. George compensated carefully for the increased distance and fired. The sniper fell, the sixth kill, but this kill brought a response George had not anticipated at all. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They had somehow triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short, and George realized instantly that the third salvo would hit the bunker directly. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater just as the third salvo obliterated the bunker he had occupied moments before. Explosions and flying debris consumed the position completely. George relocated immediately to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The massive trunk provided excellent cover and maintained a clear view of the groves. He settled in and resumed his deadly watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon because they knew George was hunting them, and now they were hunting him back. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. This was no longer simple target shooting. This had become a duel between professionals. At 2:23 in the afternoon, George killed his seventh sniper. At 3:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed incredibly high to 94 feet up a banyan tree for better concealment. But the extreme height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed, and George spotted it immediately. At 1,700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back to headquarters. He had been in position for 9 straight hours. Morris wanted exact numbers, and George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 8 hits. For misses, a 77% hit rate under combat conditions. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th, and that night George cleaned his Winchester thoroughly and considered the mathematics carefully. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead, 3 remained, and those 3 would be the absolute best, the most experienced, the ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep, but gave up at 3 in the morning, sitting in his tent with the rifle across his lap, listening to rain start again at 4:15, and by 5:30 it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used this time wisely to move to an entirely new position, not the bunker which was destroyed, not the fallen tree which was compromised, somewhere the Japanese would not expect him to be. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited patiently for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. Visibility gradually improved, and George began glassing trees again with the same methodical pattern. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, unusually low at only 40 feet up when most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation, and the palm fronds created a natural hide that would be completely invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks, and the angle gave him a view down into the fronds where he could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed carefully, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger, then stopped suddenly because something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy to spot. George had been hunting snipers for 3 full days and had killed 8 men. The remaining three would absolutely not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them so easily unless it was bait, a trap. George lowered his rifle and began scanning the surrounding trees with renewed caution. If the sniper in the palm was bait, then the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire instantly. George glassed every tree methodically, left to right, top to bottom, checking every single tree within 300 yards of that palm. It took 11 patient minutes, and at 8:28 he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in an absolutely perfect hide, with branches and vines concealing him from three sides. And he had a crystal clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George now faced two serious problems. First, the Real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position, and the sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree and begin searching for him systematically. George made his decision. He would use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted carefully for wind, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm just as planned. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up because the Real sniper would react to that shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement, and George saw it. A slight shift as the sniper repositioned to face George's actual location. George put the crosshairs on that dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The Real sniper fell, his rifle tumbling after him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds. 2 shots, 2 kills, but George had now revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran immediately, moving east along the rock line and dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away, pressing himself into the mud and waiting in absolute silence. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned just 6 seconds earlier. Bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds, and when it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving, then relocated again to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into that crater with cold water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining, and the 11th sniper would be the absolute best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning his own attack. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible, but not always identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47, George realized his critical mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees at all. He was on the ground, and he was actively moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns and vines and fallen branches, crawling steadily toward George's last known position at The rocks. George remained absolutely motionless in the water-filled crater, the Winchester already shouldered, his breathing controlled. But the angle was completely wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot, but rising up would expose him. A classic sniper's dilemma. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks and was now studying them carefully, searching for movement, for any sign of his target, and George watched through his scope, waiting, because patience was the absolute primary skill of sniper work, the ability to remain perfectly still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again, crawling forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the exact side George had used when evacuating under machine gun fire. And George understood the tactic instantly. The Japanese sniper had watched that machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George exactly the way George had been hunting him. The hunter had become the hunted. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks and moved into the old machine gun nest, taking up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but facing completely the wrong direction, his back exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot, even without a scope. But George hesitated because this sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who died because they made mistakes, and this man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, then the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. And at 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest of the rocks behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching and waiting, his rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. Two men working together, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final two snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together as a team. George made his decision quickly. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots, which gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach entirely. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface, keeping the Winchester pointed skyward to prevent water from entering the barrel. And then he waited in that freezing water, barely breathing. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rock stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seeing nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree, and both men began moving east parallel to each other 70 yards apart, executing a classic sweep pattern, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, absolutely motionless. The two Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line with their backs completely exposed, and George rose from the water slowly, silently, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder, water dripping from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face, He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. And George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt smoothly, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning rapidly, raising his rifle, but George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and began retrieving his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze completely. Voices, Japanese voices coming from the tree line, multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. There was an entire unit out there. George dropped back into the crater immediately. The water was cold and muddy, but it was cover. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear, and the Japanese voices grew steadily louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These were not snipers. They were infantry, a patrol or recovery team sent to collect bodies. George counted seconds silently. The voices stopped at the location of the first body 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly even without understanding their words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation in urgent tones. And at 10:28 the voices began moving again, but not back toward the tree line. They were coming toward George's crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been so careful about noise and movement, but he had not been careful about tracks, a fundamental mistake. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Very poor odds for a bolt-action rifle against multiple enemies. He considered his options carefully, stay hidden and hope they passed by or fight. And the voices grew closer, 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31 a.m. Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down directly at George. Their eyes met for a split second, and George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, and rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him rapidly. He climbed out of the crater on the north side away from the approaching voices and ran 20 yards before dropping behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater and around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement and sound, not at confirmed targets, and George stayed low, glassing the area through his scope. He saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier and fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left, and George heard more voices behind him now. The Japanese were flanking. One group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision instantly. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers armed with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact immediately and move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack, and the pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using terrain for cover, moving northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was eerily quiet. No voices, no movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him aggressively. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported directly to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief immediately, and George provided it with clinical precision. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits, 1 miss, then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills, 5 total rounds. In that engagement, Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. Field stripped the Winchester and spent 2 meticulous hours cleaning every component, cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out completely clean. Checked the scope mounts, adjusted eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. And at 1,400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George immediately. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report, unauthorized. Engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, and Ferry had exactly one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time and rifles with optics and men who could already shoot well. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one non-negotiable condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request immediately. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes went to the men George would train over the coming weeks. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with the absolute fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the unertl scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable but exhausting to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags, because the jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 intensive days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation, and by January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under realistic field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged, and after each kill the roles could switch, which kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikaw River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers necessarily, just infantry, stragglers who had not yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20 a.m., Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 missed due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day with 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February, and by February 9th the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative. Only counted confirmed kills where the body could be directly observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rear guard actions, and George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down hard. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed, they told George he would recover, but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital, and during that time the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by Division Headquarters, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was far from finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new classified mission. Something in Burma, something dangerous. George volunteered immediately, and by March George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 packed carefully in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. George did not know the specific details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove extremely useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet, but the men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders, and that name would become legendary in the annals of World War II history. George's journey from Illinois shooting champion to jungle sniper to special operations soldier was far from over, and the Winchester Model 70 that had killed 11 Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal would travel with him through some of the most brutal jungle warfare ever conducted. But that is another story for another time. The rifle that military officers had mocked as a mail-order sweetheart had proven itself in the most demanding test possible, actual combat against trained enemy snipers. And John George had proven that sometimes individual skill and the right tool mattered more than firepower and military doctrine. His legacy would influence American military sniper doctrine for generations to come. And today that Winchester Model 70 sits in a display case at the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Most visitors walk past without stopping because it looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but you know better now. You know that rifle cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. You know it proved that a civilian marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. And you know it changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. John George lived to be 90 years old. He died on January 3rd, 2009, having witnessed the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. Having watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment, and having watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. But his story, his incredible achievement on Guadalcanal, remains one of the most remarkable demonstrations of individual marksmanship under combat conditions ever recorded. And now you are part of keeping that memory alive.